What would you do if the most dangerous man in the city looked at you like you were the only thing standing between him and the edge of a cliff, and you were just trying to finish your shift? Because that's exactly what happened to a 23-year-old waitress named Sloane Hadley on a Tuesday night in November, when a man walked into the Copper Kettle Diner on the east end of Halifax and ordered black coffee, no cream, no sugar, no small talk, and changed the course of both their lives before the cup was even halfway empty. But before we get there, you need to understand who Callum Doyle really was. Not the version the newspapers printed. Not the version his lawyers maintained in polished conference rooms overlooking the harbor. The real version, the one his enemies whispered about, and his allies never dared to confirm out loud. Callum Doyle was 41 years old, 6'2", and had been running the East Coast's most quietly efficient criminal organization since he was 29. He didn't look like what people imagined when they heard the word crime boss. No flashy rings, no aggressive cologne. He dressed like a man who attended board meetings and won them, because most of the time, that's exactly what he did. The Doyle Syndicate operated beneath 3 layers of legitimate business: a shipping logistics firm, a waterfront property development company, and a restaurant group that actually turned a profit. And Callum managed all of it with the same cold precision a surgeon brings to an operating table. He had not survived 12 years at the top by being sentimental. He had not survived by trusting people easily, by letting his guard down, by carrying anything on his person that could be used against him. So when Sloane Hadley reached across the counter to refill his coffee and accidentally knocked his jacket off the stool beside him, and then, apologizing, bent down to pick it up, neither of them was prepared for what fell out of the inside pocket. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a phone. It wasn't anything that could be traced back to the Doyle name. It was a child's drawing, folded in thirds, worn soft at the creases, the paper yellowed with age, a crayon house with a red door, 2 stick figures, one tall, one very small, standing in front of it, and in the corner, in the shaky handwriting of a child who was just learning to form letters, "For Callie, so you don't forget home." Sloane stood up. She looked at the drawing, she looked at the man, and Callum Doyle, who had not flinched in front of men twice his size, who had negotiated in rooms where losing meant disappearing, went completely, utterly still. Stay with us, because this story is not what you think it is. If you're new here, welcome to Sadie's Romance Library. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. And if this one gets you the way it got me, leave a comment below. We read every single one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Sloane Hadley had been working at the Copper Kettle for 14 months, which was about 13 months longer than she'd planned. She'd moved to Halifax from a small town outside of Truro after her mother's health started declining, wanting to be closer, wanting to help with the medical bills that were quietly eating through everything her mother had saved. She'd intended to find something in her field. She had a degree in social work, half finished before she ran out of funding, but the Copper Kettle had needed someone immediately. The manager, Bev, had taken a chance on her, and then her mother had gotten worse, and then the shifts had started feeling less temporary. That's the thing about survival. It has a way of becoming routine before you realize you've stopped planning for anything else. The Copper Kettle was the kind of place that had been in the same spot for 40 years without changing its menu or its lighting, or the particular way the front door stuck in damp weather. Locals loved it for exactly that reason. It was a neighborhood institution. Formica counters, laminated placemats, a pie display case near the register that was never less than half full. Bev had worked there since she was 17 and now owned it outright. And she ran it with the kind of warm authority that made everyone who walked through the door feel vaguely like they were at their grandmother's house. It was not the kind of place that men like Callum Doyle frequented, which was exactly why he chose it. He'd been coming in for 3 weeks before that November Tuesday, always late, after the dinner rush, before closing, always the same stool, the same order. He tipped well and said almost nothing, and Sloane had privately decided he was either going through a divorce or finishing a book, because those were the only 2 reasons a person sat alone in a diner at 10:30 at night with that particular expression on their face. She'd learned not to push conversation on the quiet ones. She brought the coffee, kept it topped up, left him alone. It was a system that worked, until the jacket fell, until she picked it up and the drawing came loose from the pocket. She held it out to him, just that, just handing it back. And she watched something cross his face that she hadn't seen in all those 3 weeks of silence. Something unguarded. Something that looked against all odds like grief. "Sorry," she said, because she didn't know what else to say. It fell. He took it from her carefully, not quickly, not sharply, carefully, the way you'd take something fragile. He looked at it for a moment, and then he folded it back exactly as it had been and tucked it back into his jacket. And when he looked up, his face had rearranged itself back into something neutral. "It's fine," he said. But Sloane Hadley had spent 2 years watching her mother move through the stages of grief over a life she hadn't finished living, and she knew what loss looked like on a face when it was trying very hard to look like something else. She refilled his coffee without being asked. He didn't leave until closing. He came back the next night. And the night after that. The difference was that now, occasionally, he talked. Not about himself. Not about anything that revealed a name, a profession, a life outside the diner. He asked about her. Or rather, he listened when she mentioned things in the way people do when the silence gets comfortable enough. He learned about her mother, about the social work degree, about the town she'd come from. He didn't offer sympathy in the hollow way people often do. He just listened, and sometimes he said something that was so precisely accurate that it startled her. On the 4th night, she asked about the drawing. She hadn't planned to. It came out the way things do when you've been thinking about something for too long, and your mouth moves before your judgment catches up. "The drawing," she said, refilling his cup. "The one that fell, was that yours? From when you were little?" He looked at her for a long moment. She braced for the shutters to come down. "It was given to me," he said finally, "by someone I used to know. Someone you lost?" Another pause. "Yes, I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "Her name was Petra," he said, which was the first name he'd ever said to her. "She was 7. I was 9. We were at—" He stopped, picked up his cup, set it back down. "We grew up together for a while, in the same place. She called me Callie because she couldn't say Callum properly." Sloane felt something tighten in her chest. What happened to her? "I don't know." He said it the way someone says something they've said so many times it stopped feeling like the truth and started feeling like a scar. "We were separated. I've been looking for 32 years. She didn't ask anything else that night. But she thought about it, the way you think about something that lodges itself under your skin without permission. While she wiped down the counters, while she drove home through the rain, while she sat beside her mother's bed and held her hand in the quiet. A man who ran from nothing, carrying a child's crayon drawing for 32 years. Trying to find a little girl named Petra. What Sloane didn't know, what she had no reason to know, was that in the 3 weeks Callum Doyle had been sitting at her counter, someone had been watching her, not because of anything she'd done, not because of who she was, because of who her mother was. Vivienne Hadley, née Voss, had come to Nova Scotia in 1989 from Montreal, pregnant and alone, carrying very little and saying nothing about why she'd left or who she'd left behind. She'd built a quiet life, worked hard, raised Sloane on her own, never talked about the past. What she had never told her daughter was that before Halifax, before the small town outside Truro, before any of it, Vivienne Voss had worked for 18 months as a bookkeeper for a man named Gerald Doyle, Callum's father. And when Gerald Doyle was killed in the winter of 1991 in a dispute that rewrote the power structure of Atlantic organized crime, Vivienne had been the only person outside the family who knew the full scope of what Gerald had been building. She'd seen the accounts. She'd seen the ledgers. She'd seen the name of the man who'd ordered the hit, a man named Aldrich Payne, who in 1991 had been 30 years old and ambitious, and who was now, 3 decades later, 73, and retired and believed by almost everyone to have simply aged out of the life. Callum Doyle had spent 12 years looking for the proof that Aldrich Payne had killed his father. And Vivienne Hadley had been sitting on it, without even knowing the full weight of what she held, for 32 years. She hadn't come forward because she was afraid, because she had a daughter to protect, because she had told herself it was the past, it was over, it didn't matter anymore. But Aldrich Payne's people had long memories. And when Vivienne's hospital admission, her name, her old name, her real name had appeared in a database that the wrong people had access to, it had set something in motion. And now there were two men watching the copper kettle. Neither of them worked for Callum. The night it broke open was a Thursday. Sloane was closing alone. Bev had left early because of her knee, and she was in the back doing the deposit when she heard the front door open, which shouldn't have been possible because she'd locked it. She came out of the back and found two men standing inside the diner. They didn't look like customers. One of them was holding up a photograph. He asked if she knew the woman in it. It was her mother. "I don't know who that is," Sloane said, because every nerve in her body had gone very quiet and very cold, and something animal in her understood that the correct answer was denial. "That's too bad," the man said, "because we have a few questions for her, and she seems to be unavailable." He said it pleasantly, which was worse than if he'd said it any other way. "We thought maybe you might be able to help instead." What happened next was something Sloane would replay for years. Not the fear, she'd process the fear later, in stages, like a long bill finally coming due, but the decision itself. She had a phone in her apron pocket. She'd been texting Bev earlier about the deposit. And in the side pocket, tucked beneath her order pad, was a business card that a man named Callum had left on the counter 3 nights ago, without any explanation, with nothing on it but a number. She had thought at the time that it was probably his way of asking her to dinner, and she had already been deciding whether she would call it. She called it now. She pressed it against her leg, dialed with her thumb, and kept her eyes on the two men and her voice steady. It rang twice. Yes. His voice was immediate. Present, like he'd been awake. She said the name of the diner. She said, "I think you should come." And then she said carefully, "There are two men here who have a photograph of my mother." A pause so brief, it was barely a pause at all. "Don't move," he said. "Keep them talking. I'll be there in 4 minutes." It was 3:30. She didn't see what happened outside. She heard it, or rather, she heard the absence of it, the sudden quiet that replaced whatever the two men had expected to walk back out to. What she saw was the door opening and Callum Doyle walking in, and the way the two men's faces changed when they saw him told her everything she needed to understand about who he was. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch anyone. He simply stood in the doorway in the cold November air and looked at them with an expression that communicated, clearly and without a single word, that the next several decisions they made would determine a great deal about how the rest of their lives went. They left. Callum closed the door. He looked at Sloane, who was standing behind the counter holding her order pad like a shield because it was the only thing her hands had thought to grab. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Who are they?" He pulled out his stool, and sat down. He didn't answer right away. She had the sense that he was doing something careful with words, measuring what to give her. "They work for a man who has very old reasons to want to find your mother," he said finally. Sloane stared at him. "How do you know anything about my mother?" "I didn't," he said, "until about 40 seconds ago." He told her, not everything, not all at once, but enough. Vivienne Voss, the book she'd kept, Gerald Doyle, who had been his father, Aldrich Payne, who had ordered his death, the 32 years Callum had spent building something large enough and strong enough that he could finally dismantle the man who had taken everything from him, and the one piece he'd never been able to find. The evidence, the thing his father had been building, the record of it. "Your mother was his bookkeeper," Callum said. "She was with the organization for 18 months. She would have had access to everything." Sloane sat down on the stool at the end of the counter. Her legs had decided to stop cooperating. "She never told me any of this," she said. "I know. She was protecting you. She's sick." Sloane heard her own voice like it was coming from a distance. "She's been in the hospital for 6 weeks. She's not. She can't have a conversation about any of this. There are days she doesn't know where she is." Callum was quiet for a moment. "Then we need to find it before Payne's people do," he said. Sloane looked at him. "Why do you say we?" He held her gaze. "Because they now know your face." She went home that night with a man she'd known for 3 weeks sitting outside in a black SUV at the end of her street, which should have been terrifying and was, a little, but was also, and this was the part she couldn't quite explain to herself, something else. Something that felt like being held up by something she hadn't expected to be solid. She didn't sleep much. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold and thought about her mother. About all the things Vivian Hadley had never said. About the way her mother had always had a particular stillness when the news mentioned organized crime. About how she'd never had a single photograph from before 1989. About how she'd chosen a town small enough that no one would think to look, and then when she got sick, had ended up in a hospital in Halifax where her name was in a database. Sloane had always assumed her mother's silence about the past was grief. A lost relationship, maybe. Something ordinary and painful. She had not imagined this. In the morning, she went to the hospital. Her mother was having a clear day. Those still happened. Not often now, but sometimes. Vivian Hadley was 61 years old and had the kind of face that must have been striking when she was young and was still, even now, defined by a quality of quiet dignity that Sloane had spent her whole life trying to understand and had never quite been able to name. She sat beside the bed and she held her mother's hand and she said gently, "Mum, I need you to tell me about Gerald Doyle." The quality of her mother's stillness changed. She didn't deny it. She didn't pretend. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, and then she closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something in them had shifted. Some decision made, some weight finally set down. "There's a blue notebook," Vivian said. Her voice was soft, careful with syllables, the way it had been getting lately. "In the lining of the trunk in the storage locker. The locker key is on the ring with the old house keys. I kept meaning to." She stopped, pressed Sloane's hand. "I kept meaning to do something with it. I never knew what to do. What's in it? Everything." A pause. "Everything he built. All of it. And the man who took it from him. His name, his accounts, his signatures. Gerald was careful. He knew something was coming. He hid copies. And you kept them. I was afraid to destroy them. I was afraid to come forward. I was afraid that if I did either, they'd find me and they'd..." She looked at Sloane. "You were 11 months old. I couldn't." Sloane squeezed her hand. "I understand," she said, and she did. The storage locker was on the north end of the city, a facility that had clearly been there since the 90s and smelled like it. The trunk was exactly where her mother had said. The key was on the ring. Callum had driven her. He stood back while she opened the trunk, while she found the lining, while she pulled out a slim blue notebook. Cloth cover, elastic closure, the kind you could find in any dollar store, that turned out to contain 47 pages of the most meticulous financial documentation Sloane had ever seen. She handed it to him. He stood in the fluorescent light of the storage locker and turned the pages slowly, and she watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before. Not shock, not triumph, something quieter and deeper, the kind of feeling that doesn't have a clean name because it lives too close to grief to be purely good. "He did it," Callum said very quietly. Not to her, to himself, to the ghost of a father he'd been trying to protect for 32 years. He kept it. Sloane gave him the moment. "Then, what do we do with it?" He closed the notebook, looked at her. "I have a contact, former RCMP, works independent investigations now. This goes to her. She'll know how to move it in a way that can't be buried. Aldrich Payne will be facing a very different kind of retirement by the end of the month." Sloane nodded slowly. "And us? What about?" She stopped. "What about the people who came into the diner? Are they going to—" "No." He said it with the kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly what levers to pull and having already pulled them. "That's handled." She believed him. Not blindly. She wasn't a blind faith kind of person. And the last 48 hours had done a great deal to make her practical about things she'd previously been idealistic about. She believed him because she'd watched him operate, and because she understood now that the precision she'd read as coldness was actually something more specific. Control in the service of loyalty, to his father's memory, to a code she didn't fully understand but could see the shape of. She picked up the empty trunk and set it back where it had been. She turned off the storage locker light. She walked out into the gray Halifax morning and Callum Doyle walked beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "Petra." He stopped walking. "The little girl," she said. The one who gave you the drawing. You said her last name was Voss, right? That's what you said last week, that you'd tried to find records with the name Voss. Very slowly, Callum turned to look at her. Because he hadn't said that. He had said Petra. He had said she couldn't pronounce his name properly. He had never said the surname. How do you know that name? He asked. Sloane felt something move through her, a cold, electric thing, the sensation of two lines in a story toward each other across 30 years. Voss, she said carefully, was my mother's maiden name. Her name before she came to Halifax. Vivienne Voss. The sound of the harbor, a gull somewhere above them, the distant percussion of the city going about its morning. My mother had a sister, Sloane said. She died when I was very young. I know almost nothing about her. She was taken into care in 1987, when she was very small. Her name was Petra, Callum said. His voice had gone to a place beyond ordinary. My mother never talked about her. Sloane's eyes were filling, which annoyed her and she couldn't stop it. I always assumed I didn't know. She never. Callum turned away from her. He stood facing the harbor for a long moment, and she watched his shoulders do something complicated. He was a man who did not cry, she was certain of that, but he was also a man who was right now taking in the fact that the little girl he'd carried in a folded crayon drawing for 32 years was the sister of the woman who had just handed him the thing he'd spent 12 years building toward. When he turned back, his face was very controlled, but his eyes were not. She's gone, he said. It wasn't a question. Years ago, Sloane said softly. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. He nodded once. The kind of nod that's really a closing. A door gently shut on a room you can't go back into. But she existed, Sloane said. She was real. She was loved. She had a sister who never stopped, who kept a key in a trunk for 30 years because she didn't know what to do. She paused. And she had a 9-year-old boy who called her Petra and kept her drawing. Callum looked at her for a long time. She called me Callie, he said, because she was 4 and Callum was too many syllables. That sounds exactly right, Sloane said. And despite everything, despite the storage locker and the 2 men in the diner and the notebook full of 30-year-old crimes and the particular weight of the morning, something in his face shifted. Not into happiness exactly, into something that had space in it for the first time. You have good instincts, he said finally. For someone who thought I was going through a divorce. She laughed, startled into it. How did you? I noticed things. A pause. It's a professional requirement. She shook her head. That is possibly the most alarming sentence I've ever heard. You called a stranger's phone number in the middle of a crisis. That was also alarming in retrospect. It was, he agreed. It was also brave. She looked at him in the gray morning light. This man who was not at all what she'd expected, and also was, in ways she was still figuring out, exactly what she should have seen the first night when he ordered black coffee and sat in the corner, like a man who'd been carrying something for too long. What happens now? She asked. The notebook goes to my contact today. Payne's people pull back, they already have. He paused. Your mother is safe. You're safe. And you? He was quiet for a moment. Something that was almost uncertainty crossed his face, which on him looked like a very new expression, like something trying out its legs. I'd like to come back to the diner, he said carefully. If that's still an option, without the circumstances. Sloane considered this. You're going to have to order something other than just coffee, she said. Bev's been personally offended for 3 weeks. I'll order the pie. Which one? Whatever you recommend. She thought about it. Butter tart. It's a Canadian classic, and you've been missing out. All right, and you'll have to talk more. Not about work. Not about, she gestured vaguely at the general enormity of the last 48 hours. Just normal things. I can try, he said, which she appreciated more than a promise would have been, because it was honest. She zipped up her jacket against the morning cold. Then yes, she said. It's still an option. They walked back to the car. Halifax moved around them, ordinary and unhurried. The harbor flat and gray and lovely in the way of things that have been there long enough to stop needing to announce themselves. He opened the passenger door before she reached it, which she noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. 3 weeks later, the notebook made the news. Not as a notebook, as an investigation, as a name. As a man who had believed for 33 years that the past stayed buried if you simply refused to look at it. Aldrich Payne was 73 and retired, and then, very quickly, he was not either of those things. Callum Doyle's name appeared nowhere. That was the point. Vivian Hadley had a particularly clear day the afternoon it broke, and Sloane read her the headline, gently, in the hospital room with the curtains half open and the late afternoon light coming in soft from the west. Her mother listened. She closed her eyes. "Is he safe?" she asked. "Gerald's boy." "He is," Sloane said. Vivian nodded, slowly, the way people do when they set something they've been carrying for so long it has left marks. "Good," she said. "That's good." She fell asleep holding Sloane's hand. And in the corner of the room, on the small shelf where Sloane kept a few things to make the space feel less clinical, there was a paper, folded in thirds, unfolded and carefully refolded again, the creases soft with age. A crayon house with a red door, 2 stick figures. For Callie. "So you don't forget home." Vivienne had asked to keep it there, when Sloane had shown her. "So she's with us," she'd said. So she was. Hey, if this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Sloane handing that drawing back across the counter, or Callum standing in a storage locker with 30 years of grief in a blue notebook, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below. Tell me which moment got you. Tell me if you saw the Petra connection coming before the reveal, because some of you are very clever and I want to know. And if you're new to Sadie's Romance Library, welcome home. We have a lot more where this came from. Subscribe so you're here for the next one, because next time, we're following a woman who inherits a lighthouse on the coast of Newfoundland, and the man who's been living in it without permission for 2 years and absolutely does not want to leave. He has reasons, she has opinions, neither of them is as ready as they think. We'll see you there.